Good morning, everybody. Rodger here once again. It's great to see everybody today. I have a few thoughts I'd like to share with you about what God has been speaking to Lynn and I about over the last 6 months or so. And we're back in the States for a bit, and it's just been good to be with family and care for those we love on this side of the water for a while. The last 6 months since the COVID-19 pandemic began and the world as we know it began to change, there's been a lot of political unrest, mistrust, people manipulating narratives and stories, and lots of people jockeying for personal gain, lots of civil unrest, racial division, hoarding. Who would have thought that toilet paper would be a thing? But it is. Social media has not become our friend. And the Church of Jesus around the world is in danger of losing sight of the mission of God. That's the bad news. The good news is that God's not surprised. He's not afraid. He's not divided. He's not unsettled. But He is pivoting. He's changing. He's innovating. He's preparing us. He's gifting us. And He's offering us an opportunity to see the world and ourselves very, very differently. Also, the illusion, as we know it, of bootstrapping, self-directing, unadulterated independence, that's been unmasked. And the world is in great need. And the good news that I want to share with you today is that God is with us. And He's shaping us, and He's shaping you for His blessing. In Mozambique, we tell lots of stories, and we've been doing it for a long time. And we use the stories of God and the redemptive message of His Word to bring hope to a community of people that God loves greatly and that God has a purpose for and a blessing. And we're just honored to be part of it. I'm going to share briefly three stories with you today, two of which come from one family in the Old Testament, and it's the family of Abraham. And it's a family that is blessed by God, and Abraham walked with the Lord, and he was given a great promise and a great covenant. But it was also a broken family. It was a family very similar to the family of the world today that is riddled with brokenness and manipulation and sin and usury and divination and all forms of evil. But God was with them. In the book of Genesis, actually from 25 to 45, is the story of this very, very broken family. I want to focus today not on Abraham and Isaac and Sarah, although Ishmael and Hagar is a really important truth of God's blessing and provision and love and hope for people. But today I want to focus specifically on the life of Jacob. The story of Jacob and Esau is a really important one when we talk about the fulfillment, in part, of God's promise and of His blessing. But as you know, Jacob was the favorite of his mom, and there was all kinds of problems in this story. And Jacob is actually known historically as the great deceiver, manipulator, and he took advantage of his brother and was used by his mother, and he deceived his father, and he was a coward. As we know in the story, his own brother vowed to kill him because of who he is and who he was and how he conducted himself. And this is a story of generational sin passed down from one person to the next, to the next, to the next. And it's the story of us, and it's the story of our world. There comes a point in the story where Jacob, the deceiver, once again has to leave where he's living because there's great problems in the family with his father-in-law, and he was deceived and he was used and he was manipulated, and he was ready to move on, and he had to flee in the middle of the night for fear of retribution. And his own wife stole from her own father in the process. But the scriptures tell us that God was with them, and God was with Jacob the whole time, as he was with Ishmael and Hagar. And we find Jacob in the throes of the culmination of a long period of problems. And he's actually gets word that his brother Esau is coming to see him with 400 men. And that strikes great fear in the heart of Jacob, because the last words he remembers of his brother is that, I'm going to find him and I'm going to kill him. So what does Jacob do? He separates his families, and he says, if Esau takes out part of my family, at least I'll have the other. And then he takes his beloved wife and his favorite son, Joseph, and he sets them aside. And then he himself hides behind even them for fear of his brother. But he finds himself alone. And this is a really important piece of the story of what I want to share with you today. As God is resetting the world, how God is resetting Jacob, the deceiver. And we know the story, and you may not, but for those of us that do know the story, Jacob finds himself alone, and he is confronted by a man. And this man wrestles with him all night long, and there's a wound, and there's a conversation, and Jacob is saying to this man, I will not release you until you bless me, until the fulfillment of the blessing of my family will be fulfilled through me. I will not let you go. And it's interesting, this man says to Jacob, what is your name? Not because he doesn't know, because he needed Jacob to recognize who he is, because Jacob's name means deceiver. There's this battle, there's this encounter, there's this wound, and the next morning, Jacob says to those around him, he says, I have wrestled with God and with man, and yet I did not die. As the story unfolds, something miraculous happens, because during this encounter, God, who was encountering Jacob, changes his name from deceiver to Israel, which is the name of blessing, the name of the blessing to make a great nation, to prosper, of which is a really important fulfillment of God's prophecy in the life of Jacob. And as the story unfolds, what we see is that Jacob is no longer hiding behind his wife and his beloved wife and Joseph, his favorite son. He's no longer hiding behind his clan and his herds and his wealth and his riches and his family. But what we see in the scriptures is that Jacob, Israel, is out front. And he is the first to meet his brother Esau. That is a really interesting change of events. But it's not just a change of events, it's a change in the character of Jacob. God didn't just change his name to Israel as a fulfillment of a promise. He changed his character. He changed his purpose, and he changed his vision, and he changed so much. He gave him courage. He went from a coward to a man of faith. As God is resetting the world, just like Jacob, he's resetting our character. He's wanting to use all that is happening and in the world, politically, socially, medically, with this disease, and with our relationships, and with our family, and our walk with him. We can either be cowards and hiding, or we can wrestle with God and not die, where he will change us to where we respond in ways that we never dreamed possible. God is in the reset, and it's transformative. And he's transforming me. I believe he wants to transform you as well. But like Jacob, he will transform our character, our identity, and set us on course for a new future. I mentioned earlier this Joseph, the favorite son of Israel, of Jacob. And even though God is doing such amazing things in reshaping the character of Jacob, the sin of the family continues, and there's still all kinds of brokenness and lying and deceit. As we know in the story of Joseph, he, by his own brothers, gets sold, and he gets thrown under the bus, literally, and he gets sent to Egypt as a slave. But one of the things that we know about the story of Joseph is that God was with him. God is with you. God is with me. And what man meant for evil, God meant for good. And the story of Joseph, as we read this narrative of this family, is a story of victory. It is a story of defeat. It is a story of being used and manipulated and lost and being lied about. And it's about the development of the character of a man over time through some really difficult and lonely and scary circumstances, shaping him for a great purpose. And Joseph, as we know, was the kingpin and second in command to save the people of Israel during a really, really hard time. But what man meant for evil, God meant for good. God was in the reset and maturing Joseph. James talks about, the book of James, a lot about count it all joy when we have many trials and when we have many temptations and when we are challenged by ourselves and the things of this world, because it brings about perseverance. It brings about maturity. Not only is God in this reset, He is transforming us and He's transforming our character. He is also maturing us and preparing us for what's next. The challenge is not to wallow in fear, but to look to see what's next and what God is transforming us to be and in what He is transforming us for. God is in the reset and He's preparing us for His purpose and His vision. Are we prepared for that? Are we looking for that? I'm going to skip way ahead now to a completely different story. And it's the story of the calling of Simon Peter. God used this story greatly in my life recently when I was casting my nets in vain and coming up empty over and over and over again. I was desperate for answers. I was desperate for solutions. I was panicking because I could not meet what I believed I needed to provide for my family and for others and for the work that God had called me to. And it was through the story of the calling of Simon Peter that God spoke to me, and He says, Rodger, you are casting your nets based on what you think you know. You're trusting in your past, you're trusting in your abilities, you're trusting in your context, you're just trusting in everything but me. And one early morning, had my coffee, had the Word, and I was praying as I was casting my nets in vain. And God said to Rodger, He said, Rodger, I want you to cast your net in this way and in this place. And my answer was, no, like Simon Peter, I've done that and I've been casting and I'm not going to do that. And the Lord says, you either obey or fail. And through the Spirit of God and of nothing in me, I should say, I obeyed with a little bit of faith and in a last-ditch effort that God would be true and faithful and honor His word. I cast my net differently in a way that was unexpected, and the Lord filled my nets. You know, my prayer for all of you today is that your nets would be full. And whatever needs to be in those nets, that's between you and the Father, and you talk about that every day. But He's asking you to cast your nets differently during this season. But what I learned is that to cast my nets differently, I need to have a different character. I need to have a different purpose and a vision, but I need to obey. And obedience to the Father is essential to His ability to work in us and through us and provide for us. And like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Esau and his family, Joseph and his brothers, and the fulfillment of His purposes and His blessing, they all had to obey. We all have to wrestle, and we will not die. We all have to be transformed in our character. We all have to have a new and fresh vision of the Lord. But ultimately, when the Lord speaks to us, as God is resetting this world, He is resetting you. Don't be afraid, because He is with you. We must obey. But as we obey, the promise is still true today, that God our Father is with us. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God has already walked before you. Deuteronomy 31:8. God be with you guys today. Let your hearts be full. Let you be full of courage and character and vision and purpose. Be transformed, be obedient, and ultimately, like Simon Peter, as he began to trust and follow Jesus, may your nets be full.